On a cold January evening in 1931, William Herbert Wallace left his home in Liverpool to meet a man he had never seen. The prospective client had provided a name, a time, and an address, but the address did not exist. When Wallace finally returned to Wolverton Street, he found his wife, Julia, dead in their front parlor. What followed became one of the most closely examined and enduring murder mysteries in British criminal history. William and Julia Wallace lived at 29 Wolverton Street in Anfield, in a narrow terraced house typical of the neighborhood. William worked as an insurance agent, collecting premiums from customers across Liverpool. He was also interested in science, music, and chess. Julia shared his interest in music, and the couple were regarded as quiet and private. There was no outward sign that their ordinary household was approaching a moment of irreversible violence. The sequence began on Monday, January 19. That evening, Wallace attended the Liverpool Central Chess Club, which met at the City Café in the center of Liverpool. He was expected to play a scheduled match. Shortly before he arrived, the club received a telephone call from a man asking to speak to him. Because Wallace was not yet present, the caller left a message with the club captain, Samuel Beattie. The caller gave his name as R.M. Qualtrough. He said he wished to discuss insurance and asked Wallace to visit him at 25 Menlove Gardens East at 7:30 the following evening. Beattie wrote down the details and passed them to Wallace when he arrived. Wallace reportedly did not recognize the name. Nevertheless, a request from a possible client was consistent with his work, and he decided to keep the appointment. The message contained just enough detail to appear genuine. Menlove Gardens was a real district in South Liverpool, some distance from Wallace's home. There were streets known as Menlove Gardens North, South, and West, but there was no Menlove Gardens East. That subtle falsehood would become the central feature of the case, an invented address hidden within a real and unfamiliar part of the city. The telephone call was traced to a public call box near the chess club. Its location raised an immediate question. The caller may have known that Wallace attended the club on Monday evenings and may also have known when he was likely to arrive. Yet the call itself did not prove that Wallace would accept the appointment. The plan depended on the message reaching him and on his willingness to travel across Liverpool the next night. On Tuesday, January 20, Wallace followed his normal routine. He conducted insurance business during the day and returned home later. He prepared to leave for the Qualtrough appointment. The precise timing of events inside 29 Wolverton Street would soon become critically important. Investigators would attempt to fit a brutal killing into a narrow period before Wallace began a journey observed by conductors, passengers, and people he approached for directions. One of the last independent witnesses believed to have seen Julia alive was a local milk delivery boy. His recollection placed her at the house during the early evening, although the exact time became the subject of disagreement and later scrutiny. A few minutes in either direction mattered. If Julia was alive shortly before Wallace departed, the prosecution's eventual theory would become much harder to reconcile with the available time. Wallace left Wolverton Street and began a complicated tram journey toward Menlove Gardens. He was not moving invisibly. He spoke to transport employees and asked several people how to reach Menlove Gardens East. Some later regarded these inquiries as entirely natural for a man searching for an unfamiliar address. Others wondered whether Wallace was deliberately creating witnesses who could confirm that he had spent the evening looking for Qualtrough. He arrived in the Menlove Gardens area and searched among its curved roads and large suburban houses. Wallace asked residents, a police officer, and others for assistance. No one could direct him to Menlove Gardens East. He examined street signs and house numbers, trying to locate number 25. The more he searched, the clearer it became that the directions left at the chess club led nowhere. Wallace eventually called at 25 Menlove Gardens West, apparently considering whether the message had been recorded incorrectly. The occupants knew nothing of R.M. Qualtrough or an insurance appointment. By then, Wallace had spent a substantial period in the district. At approximately 8 o'clock, with no client and no valid address to be found, he began the return journey toward Anfield and the darkened house on Wolverton Street. When Wallace reached number 29, he tried the front door but could not open it. He then went around to the rear entrance and had difficulty there as well. Returning to the front, he encountered his next-door neighbors, John and Florence Johnston, who were leaving their house. Wallace told them he could not get inside and expressed concern that something might be wrong. In their presence, he tried the door again. This time, the door opened. Wallace entered while the Johnstons remained nearby. The house was dim and quiet. In the front parlor, Julia lay on the floor beside the fireplace. She had suffered devastating blows to the head. Blood marked the room, and a raincoat belonging to Wallace was found beneath or around part of her body. The weapon used to kill her was not recovered. The scene suggested extreme violence, but the rest of the house did not show the disorder expected after a broad, uncontrolled search. In the kitchen, an insurance collection cash box had been disturbed. A relatively modest amount of money appeared to be missing, while other items of value remained. This created two possibilities. Robbery had been the motive, or the missing money had been arranged to make murder look like robbery. Police were summoned and the house became a crime scene. Investigators examined doors, windows, fireplaces, drains, clothing, and surfaces. They searched for a blood-stained weapon and for signs that an intruder had forced entry. None provided a simple answer. If a stranger had entered, Julia may have admitted that person willingly. If Wallace was responsible, he had somehow left the house without carrying obvious traces of the attack. The false address immediately appeared to be connected to the killing. A caller had arranged for Wallace to be away at a predictable time, sending him on a long journey that could not quickly be completed. The plan seemed designed to empty the house. It also suggested knowledge of Wallace's occupation, his chess club, and his routines. Someone familiar with the couple might have expected Julia to open the door once her husband had left. Yet investigators began considering another interpretation. Perhaps Wallace himself had placed the call and manufactured the appointment. Under that theory, Qualtrough was not an outside conspirator but the foundation of a planned alibi. Wallace could kill Julia before departing, then make himself conspicuous while searching for the non-existent address. His many requests for directions which supported his story could also be viewed as evidence of preparation. That theory faced a practical obstacle: time. Wallace would have needed to attack Julia shortly before leaving, clean himself sufficiently, conceal or dispose of the weapon, and reach public transport without appearing blood-stained or distressed. The injuries indicated a forceful assault likely to produce considerable blood. Investigators found no convincing trail showing where Wallace had washed, what he had worn, or how he had removed incriminating evidence so quickly. The raincoat found near Julia became an important part of the prosecution's case. It was suggested that Wallace might have used it as protection against blood during the attack, but its position could be interpreted in different ways. A killer might have worn it, placed it over Julia, or simply caused it to fall during the struggle. The coat was suspicious, but it did not establish who had handled it or why. The telephone call presented similar difficulties. Witnesses who knew Wallace were asked about the caller's voice, but telephone sound quality and human memory were limited. Some thought there were similarities, others could not confidently identify him. There was no recording, no fingerprint evidence capable of resolving the issue, and no witness who could place Wallace inside the call box. The caller remained a voice reconstructed through second-hand recollection. Police examined Wallace's movements and personal circumstances. No persuasive domestic motive emerged. The marriage was sometimes described as reserved, but evidence of serious conflict was lacking. Wallace did not appear to gain a clear financial advantage from Julia's death. His calm, formal manner attracted suspicion in an era when investigators and newspapers often treated grief as something that should look a particular way. Composure, however, was not proof of murder. Investigators also had to consider an intruder. The caller might have arranged the appointment, followed Wallace's departure, and approached Julia under a plausible pretext. A person familiar with insurance work could have known about the collection money kept in the house. The limited theft may have reflected panic, interruption, or an incorrect belief that more cash would be available. But no intruder was identified, and no reliable physical trace led away from the scene. Another possibility was that the caller and killer were different people acting together. One could make the call while the other entered the house, reducing the risk that a single person's movements would expose the plan. Later writers examined individuals connected to Wallace's work and social circle, including people who may have understood his routes and habits. None of those theories produced evidence strong enough to support a prosecution. Despite the unanswered questions, police arrested Wallace. The case against him was circumstantial. Prosecutors argued that he had invented Qualtrough, made the telephone call, killed Julia, and then departed on his carefully documented journey. His knowledge of the appointment and his conspicuous search were presented as parts of the deception. The defense answered that the schedule was implausibly tight and that the supposed plan was needlessly uncertain and complicated. Wallace went on trial at Liverpool in April 1931. The courtroom heard testimony about tram times, the milk delivery, the telephone message, the non-existent address, the condition of the parlor, and Wallace's behavior. Jurors were asked to evaluate not a direct identification or confession, but an accumulation of disputed details. Each fact seemed capable of pointing in two directions, depending on whether Wallace was viewed as a bereaved husband or a calculating planner. The prosecution emphasized design. The false address had removed Wallace from the house and allowed him to display his search to numerous witnesses. The defense emphasized physical reality. A man committing such a violent killing would have had little time to avoid blood contamination, restore his appearance, hide the weapon, and catch his tram. No blood-stained clothing was produced, no murder weapon was connected to him, and no witness saw him make the call. After deliberation, the jury found William Herbert Wallace guilty of murdering Julia. He was sentenced to death. The verdict transformed uncertainty into an approaching execution. But the legal process was not finished. Wallace maintained his innocence and his lawyers appealed. The central issue was not whether suspicion existed. It was whether the prosecution's circumstantial case could reasonably support a conviction beyond doubt when its timing, mechanics, and assumptions remained unresolved. On May 19, 1931, the Court of Criminal Appeal quashed the conviction. The judges concluded that the verdict was not supported by the weight of the evidence. This was an exceptional outcome. The appeal court did not identify another killer or explain the Qualtrough call. It determined that the case presented at trial was insufficient to justify Wallace's conviction. The death sentence was removed and Wallace was released. Freedom did not restore his former life. Wallace returned to a city in which many people had already formed conclusions about him. Some believed the jury had been right and that legal caution had allowed a murderer to escape. Others saw the appeal as confirmation that he had been accused on speculation. His health declined and he died in 1933, roughly 2 years after Julia's death, still publicly associated with the unanswered case. Over the following decades, detectives, journalists, lawyers, and crime historians repeatedly reconstructed the evening. They compared tram schedules, estimated walking times, studied maps, and reconsidered witness statements. Some proposed that Wallace had more time than the defense claimed. Others concluded that the murder could not realistically have been committed, concealed, and followed by his journey. The reconstructions differ because the original evidence contains uncertainties that no later calculation can fully remove. The mystery ultimately rests on several linked absences. There is no confirmed identity for R.M. Qualtrough. There is no proven explanation for how the caller knew Wallace's chess routine. There is no murder weapon, no definitive evidence of forced entry, and no reliable forensic link to an intruder. There is also no convincing demonstration of how Wallace could have carried out the attack within the available time and left apparently clean. Julia Wallace's death remains more than an intellectual puzzle. At its center was a woman killed in her own home. While the surviving records focused heavily on her husband's movements and the strange caller, no one else was charged after Wallace's conviction was overturned. The false address had succeeded in creating distance, confusion, and doubt. Whether it was an alibi or a trap has never been established. Nearly a century later, the route still leads back to the same points. A telephone call near a chess club, a name without a verified owner, a street that was never there. In a quiet house on Wolverton Street, the courts ultimately ruled only that William Wallace's guilt had not been proved. They did not solve Julia's murder. The voice that said Qualtrough and the person who entered the parlor remain unidentified.